When he was over in February, which I've got to commend him, to be quite frank. He knew his father had cancer. He wanted to come over and see him. The King didn't really want to see him. He was stopped from going to Sandringham. Is there anything historically comparable to that kind of situation where the King wanted to avoid his son?
Yeah, I mean, well, not his son, but I have to now look back on myself after saying you can't compare him to Edward VIII, and I will compare him to Edward VIII. Yes, so when Edward VIII, the ex-King Edward VIII, after he abdicated in 1936, he became Duke of Windsor. And when he would come back, sometimes for major events, like his brother's death in 1952, other times for shorter visits, his estranged sister-in-law, who became the Queen Mother, made it, sort of said you had to be careful where you hosted him, and they would pick places where the royals had an out that they could leave at a certain point, because otherwise the Queen Mother's concern was that Edward VIII, or Duke of Windsor, sorry, would hang around like a bad smell and inevitably ask for an increase in his allowance. So they...
Well, this feels very similar to when Harry was over, to be honest. But that's just my view. The word was, the phrase was that, the aides were worried they'd never get rid of him when he was over last.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so there is a direct comparison then. The Queen Mother used to say, try to pick somewhere where there's something, and not just that there would be another event, but that the royal actually had to leave the building that they were in so that there was a clear and definite endpoint to the audience.
I hope this isn't a curveball, but just generally, what do you think about Harry's behaviour? Taking a step back over the last 4 or 5 years, what do you think about his behaviour towards his family, knowing what we've known over the past, 1,000 years of royal history?
Yeah, that's a great question. I suppose for me, I'm slightly dubious of memoirs and of sit-down interviews, partly because I think they feel incredibly cathartic at the time. But you then want to move on. But you, in the public's mind, you're trapped forever like a fly in amber with these interviews and memoirs. And what you've said lasts much longer than the feelings that you had when you said them. And I don't ever really see an example in history of someone giving one of these interviews, and not just royalty, but celebrities and politicians, who have not become frustrated by its legacy. And for the Sussexes to have done so many so close together, I don't think it's a surprise that we've heard the Duchess of Sussex, allegedly say that she wants to move on. But the public moves on slower than the personalities do. The public were invited into this. And I think for him, one of the more surprising things that happened was that this man who, I always thought of as one of the great champions of privacy in the United Kingdom, and especially his family's privacy, then did reveal some very private conversations, including ones in the immediate aftermath of his grandfather's funeral. And that was very surprising to me that's what he chose to do. Purely conjectural on my part. But I don't get the impression that he necessarily thought that the consequences of this would be as severe as they have been, or that it would land as badly with the public as it has. Now, it's important to note there are many people who were very moved by what the Sussexes said, in a positive way. There were many who were outraged or dismissive or sceptical. And I think a lot of people who saw those interviews and read it felt that he had betrayed his family, and some of them felt he'd betrayed the country. So that takes a lot longer to reconcile that. And there's an old phrase or something like, if you air your dirty laundry in public, it takes a lot longer for it to dry. And I think that's a little bit of what we're seeing. But I also think it's worth remembering, he was immensely popular before all of this, and I don't think anything really lasts forever. So you could see him win that popularity back.
Well, I think it's telling since Spare, he's never gone down that route again. Do you know what I mean? He's never gone down to talking about the family again. He's completely changed. And I remember someone at Buckingham Palace when the late Queen was still alive, when things were put into her mouth. So when she had a statement or when she said something, they said that these words last forever. So they're carefully crafted. Like, for instance, the recollections may vary.
Yes.
That kind of statement, or the annus horribilis, they know that when the Queen says something, it's going to remain. Yeah. I'd wonder whether Harry, when he sat down with his ghostwriter, maybe didn't really think about that. Well, but that's just me thinking.
No, well, he wouldn't have been encouraged to see it that way. If you're going into an editorial or publishing process, they're not going to be looking at this as something that is carved into the granite face of history. They're going to be looking at something that is in a memoir, and this is a market that is used to selling celebrity memoirs, and there will have been no one around him, I would imagine, who would have said this will last forever. Yeah. It's just a different form of communication, and I think the difficulty is that he is someone who has a very prominent social position, and actually what he says will have impact beyond simply a memoir. But I think I hadn't thought of that. You're right, he has kind of pulled it back. And actually I think there were even interviews that he did with Anderson Cooper and Tom Bradby, he did them as well, where he kind of tried to pull some of the stuff back and said, like, we never said they were racist at all.
For many it's too late, but let's see what happens.
Yeah.
One thing that Harry and Meghan have been doing, just moving on, is Nigeria.
Yes.
Loads and loads of pictures. We saw Meghan in so many outfits. I think someone counted up it's about £125,000 worth of outfits. I'm not a fashion expert, as you can probably tell, but I think she wanted to be photographed. She wanted to be seen. It wasn't a royal tour. Was it a troublesome trip, do you think, for the palace? Was it a successful trip for Harry and Meghan? What's your reading of this faux royal tour?
Yeah, it is. I mean, when is a tour not a tour? It's a bit like beauty's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? I mean, obviously it's not an official royal tour, but it looks and acts like one. And there were moments that seemed quasi-official. You had the moment of God Save the King being played at public dinners, and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex standing for that. I think from their perspective, from the Sussexes' perspective, and particularly from the Duchess of Sussex perspective, it was a success. I mean, the headlines were, broadly speaking, overwhelmingly positive. I think there was a little bit of pushback in the Nigerian press, but that's sort of the exception that proves the rule. I think mostly the Nigerian media were very positive about the tour. Likewise in Britain, although, again, there were some questions asked. The palace, I wonder, would they find it troubling? I mean, I don't think they would ever want to see an alternative royal family emerging.
It's almost. They've set up the office of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex,
yes,
rather than calling it Archwell. They still call themselves Archwell's the charitable foundation kind of side of things, but everything from them now is the office of.
Yes.
They've got their own coat of arms, and now they're going on a tour. We have the potential for, and we're talking medieval history or talking back in the past.
Yeah, the rival king.
We've got a kind of rival Montecito household out there.
Yes, you do. To all intents and purposes, that is a very real possibility. The problem for them, for the Sussexes, is that once you start doing anything like that, people become a lot more critical of what you do outside that. So things like commercial endeavours or quasi-royal tours, people put it under more of a microscope than they would if you were calling it simply the office of Harry and Meghan. It's interesting. I wonder, is it part of an attempt to pivot from, really some harsh headlines they've had in the last year or two? Is it maybe to go in a slightly more socially conservative direction and have themselves as sort of royals in exile, for want of a better word? I wonder, is that them acting on advice that people don't want to hear another interview or another criticism of the British royal family? So it's possible.